Right. So I have got this lecture today, which is thoracic cage, the movements of respiration. You can clearly hear me now? No problem? Right.
Yes, sir, no problem.
Right. So let's get on to the thoracic cage then straight away. Have you all done any, come to any section now? Where in the thorax are you? You have examined the thoracic cage, the bones? Have you all got an opportunity or what?
We did the preview on thoracic
Okay.
yesterday, sir. SGA is going on for thoracic.
Okay. Right. So let's do the thoracic cage and then we'll get on to the movements of respiration. Now, if you look at the thoracic wall is a part of what is called the thorax. And the thorax is that part of the anatomy which is between the superior part of the trunk, that is between the neck and the abdomen. It's in the superior part of the trunk, between the neck and the abdomen. So there's the head, there's the neck, and there's the abdomen. That part is called the thorax. So that's the thorax, the part which is between the neck and the abdomen. That's the thoracic cage, very beautiful, constructed in a very fine, definitive way. A bony skeleton. It's called a cage because it is not solid bone. You can see there are openings in it like a cage where you put birds and animals. And it is called a cage because there are bones all over. You could see bones right along there, everywhere. And then, of course, there are the openings. So that's why you call it a thoracic cage. Now, to begin with, what are the functions of this thoracic cage? Here is a thoracic cage. And here is a thoracic cage filled with a few important structures in the thorax, not in the abdomen, of course. In the abdomen, you will find the liver, the spleen here, and the kidneys higher up, and so on. But this is the heart and the great vessels, as you can see. So if you look broadly at the functions of the thoracic cage, it is number one, protection. It does protect the heart and the lungs and the great vessels, which leave the heart, leave the lungs, enter the heart, enter the lungs. And of course, don't forget that it does give protection, the lower ribs and costal cartilages, to these important abdominal structures, the liver, which is a huge structure here, and the spleen related to the 9th, 10th, and 11th ribs here, the spleen. And then, of course, at L1 level, you will find even the kidneys, which are further up here. So one of its main functions is protection. The other, of course, is it forms like a chamber. You don't allow the lungs and are inside a chamber because it has to perform respiration. So like these big chambers where which become smaller and larger, the lungs become smaller and larger. So to accommodate that, it forms a big chamber to accommodate the expanding and contracting lungs. And the third function, of course, is for muscle attachment, because muscles are important and muscle attachments help in not only breathing, inspiration as well as expiration, but also in the venous return, because they do sort of virtually suck out the blood from the veins and bring it up towards the heart. So breathing and venous return. And in addition, of course, if you look carefully, the thoracic cage has a few bones, anteriorly like the clavicle and posteriorly like the scapula pasted onto it, which in turn give a certain amount of support for the other bones which hang the upper limb. So it does help indirectly to give attachment to the upper limb, which is an important movement. For example, the scapula has the glenoid cavity, and that is pasted onto the thoracic cage by muscles. And then from the glenoid cavity forms the shoulder joint, which is so important in movements. So it has an indirect attachment there, and that also does help. Now, if you look at the thoracic cage, broadly, you will see that it is made up of 12 thoracic vertebral bodies. 12 thoracic vertebral bodies. There you are. That is one body. And in between the bodies, you find a little area, sort of light purple, which are the intervertebral discs. So we have 12 thoracic vertebral bodies and the intervertebral disc. forming this posterior margin or posterior boundary of the thoracic cage. Then, of course, taking off posteriorly and coming forward, we have on each side, we have 12 ribs on each side, 12 ribs. The whitish parts coming off from there, the 12 ribs, along with their intercostal spaces, So that altogether there are 24. And then, of course, those are the 12 ribs. As you come forward, there you are. Those are the intercostal spaces, just to show you. And when you come forward, you see that these ribs are attached through certain structures, which are marked in blue here, which increase in size from number 1 going down to the structure in the midline, which is the sternum. So we have anteriorly the sternum made up of the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process at the bottom there. And then helping to attach the ribs, the bony ribs, are these little cartilaginous pieces, which are called the costal cartilages. So vertebral bodies and intervertebral discs posteriorly. Coming forward, there are the ribs, bony ribs, falling short of the manubrium and the sternum and the xiphoid process here, and that part bridged by these ever-increasing sizes of costal cartilages. They are cartilage, costal cartilage. So that together will form this entire rib cage. But of course, this rib cage has an opening superiorly, which is called the inlet, and that shows us one half of the inlet with the first rib and the costal cartilages. And the inlet is covered, is where you have the apex of the lung, the visceral pleura, the pleural space, the potential pleural space or pleural cavity. Then there's the parietal pleura, and then there is the suprapleural membrane, which bridges and covers this little opening on the side of these great vessels. And that is your suprapleural membrane there. So one there, one on the air, and the inlet, the sloping inlet, the kidney-shaped sloping inlet is covered superiorly. Oh, whatever. Yes. You can see it, yes? Is it clear? Hello?
Yes, sir. It's clear.
Right. So that is that. Then we have the outlet. Sorry. The outlet inferiorly. You can see the outlet inferiorly, there you are. And this outlet is bridged over by the diaphragm, the muscular tendinous structure arising from this crura, right and left crura. These are the arcuate lines. And then it comes and forms a muscular with a middle tendinous attachment structure. And that is the diaphragm. So that the inlet is closed and the outlet is closed. If you look at the outlet from the side and the inlet also from the side, you will see that the inlet is sloping. Can you see that? It's sloping. The anterior end of the rib is below the posterior end. And if you look at the outlet, that's the diaphragm which took off from the crura here. And it is an inverted J-shaped structure. So that the thoracic cavity has a short anterior wall and a very broad, longer posterior wall. You can see it's a long posterior wall and a short anterior wall made up of the sternum. So that's the outlet and that's the diaphragm. So if you look at the bones of the thoracic wall, you'll see that it has 12 thoracic vertebrae and intervertebral discs. That's what you have posteriorly. So you have some idea of the vertebral bodies by now. But these, if you look at the thoracic vertebral bodies, there are some features which are very special. The body, which is this one, has got facets, articulation. A superior facet, which is half a facet, that's why you call it demifacet, and an inferior one. So the body has got facets. So it is very unique, these vertebrae. Then the vertebrae have got transverse processes, one on either side, which also have facets. You can see it. There you are. And the spines are long, usually very long spines. So 3 features for the thoracic vertebra: facets on the body, facets on the transverse processes, long spines. And of course, some might say it is a heart-shaped vertebra, depends on what your concept of a heart is. Anyway, these are the superior facets for the vertebra above, and these are the inferior facets for the vertebra below. So you can see these facets, they are very important. These are the inferior facets for the vertebra above and superior facets for the vertebra below. So lots of facets, superior facets, inferior facets, facets on the side of the body, facets on the side of the transverse processes. There you are. And these are the bones of the body. So they are characteristics. So you should be able to easily identify a thoracic vertebra from a lumbar or a cervical. So there you are. Those are the body facets. That's the one for the transverse process. And those are your long spines. Just to summarize. Then, of course, between the vertebral bodies, there is the intervertebral discs. The intervertebral discs, which allow the vertebral bodies to move, help them to absorb the shock and maintain a certain amount of flexibility. And if you look at these vertebral bodies, they have a lining of hyaline cartilage, and placed on top of each is your intervertebral discs, which is made up of a broad peripheral area, which is fibrous, and a jelly-like area, softish, more liquid-like, jelly-like area, which is the nucleus. So this jelly-like area is called the nucleus, and it's in the pulp form, so you call it nucleus pulposus. And outside is your annulus fibrosus. So there you are. Those are the 2 regions of a vertebral disc. And the nucleus pulposus is the one that really gives the flexibility, the shock absorber type of function to the vertebral disc, while the annulus fibrosus holds it round. So that you're bending on the spine. If you drop from a height, it absorbs the pressure and releases it, and so on. Now, sometimes this annulus fibrosis, especially in the lumbar areas, can give way. It can break, and the nucleus pulposus can herniate out. It can happen in any direction, usually posterior or laterally. It can herniate out here. And when it herniates out, coming out of these intervertebral foramina are nerve roots. So it can hit a nerve root and cause problems with nerves. That is what is called prolapse discs. So go and read about prolapse intervertebral disc in the lumbar region. This is the intervertebral disc. That's your hyaline cartilage, which is a lining on top of the vertebral body. So, if you look carefully, therefore, vertebral bodies and the intervertebral disc, sternum in front, ribs, costal cartilages, and that's the thoracic cavity with the J-shaped diaphragm on that side. Right. So let's look at these bodies and let's look at the facets. Now, there are facets I told you on the side of the bodies. I showed it to you. Very characteristic. No other vertebral body has got facets like that. And that is for the articulation of the costa or the rib. So therefore, those facets are for the joints which are called costovertebral joints. They are synovial joints. They are synovial joints and they are called costovertebral joints. So these facets are there on the side of the vertebrae. The thoracic one has got half a facet. So the thoracic one vertebra has got a rib facet for the first rib and half a facet for the rib 2. So if you take first thoracic vertebra, there's a full facet for rib 1 and half a facet for the rib 2. And the rib 2 occupies 2 half facets. Its own one and the one above. So it goes on and on and on like that. Its own one and the one above, except the one which has got its own facet. So basically, number 1, thoracic vertebra 1 is different, having its own facet. From the 2nd to the 9th are typical, with each one having half a facet on the top and half a facet at the bottom. Demi-facets, as we call it. One for the rib above and one for the same rib. So the middle part has got the typical structure, 2 demi-facets. After that, the end is quite variable. There may be one facet, part of a facet, that facet may be on the pedicle and so on. So don't worry. Typically, 2 half facets between T2 and T9, the T1 and the ones 11, 10 and 12 at the end. So beginning and the end, it's different, it's variable. The typical ones are in the middle. If you remember that, that's more than enough. And that it is half facets. That is the most important thing. So this is the facet. Look at this. Half, if this is one rib, if this is the first rib, if this is the second rib, it occupies half of the first rib, first vertebral body, and half of its own vertebral body. And these are synovial joints. It's a nice joint capsule and so on. And that is the disc. And the rib articulates there, right there, in line with the disc. And this joint between the costo or the costa and the vertebral column are called costovertebral joints. So from the top, this is what you see of the costovertebral joint. And from the side, this is the costovertebral joint. And the rib comes on anterior like that. We are in the thoracic cavity looking at this. And behind us is the sternum. And here you are, that's the costovertebral joint. That's the transverse process. And that is the rib coming out. So costovertebral joint. What are the other facets? Well, there are the transverse processes which have got facets. Here you are, transverse processes. Now that one, what happens there is the tubercle of the rib articulates with a facet on the transverse process. So that is the same except for the last 2 or 3, again, quite variable. But the typical one has got this costotransverse joint between the rib and the transverse process. Earlier one was between the rib and the vertebra. So costovertebral and costotransverse. Both joints posteriorly placed in this rib and costal cartilage. So if I were to show both together, that's your costovertebral joint. And that is your costotransverse joint, green. Costotransverse. So costovertebral is the most posterior joint, synovial joint. Costotransverse, little bit more anterior. And that is also the synovial joint. This is the costotransverse. This is the costovertebral. The next feature of these thoracic spines, of the thoracic vertebrae, are the thoracic spines. And very easy to remember. They're nothing much. They're long spines. At the beginning, they're horizontal. At the end, they're horizontal. In between, they slope. And from about T5 to T8, they're almost vertical. They're almost vertical. And then slowly starts to become oblique and transverse. So transverse starts horizontally, starts sloping like that, becomes vertical in the middle thoracic region, and then as you go down, it again becomes oblique and becomes almost horizontal. So horizontal at the top, horizontal at the bottom, sloping to different degrees in the midline. So these are the thoracic spines. Frankly, if you get a thoracic spine, you should be able to say roughly whether it's from the middle of the spine, from the bottom, or whether it's from the top. You should be able. Don't worry about it. But the features are, sorry, long thoracic spine, facets on the transverse processes, facets on the vertebral columns, on the vertebral bodies. Those are the main features. So if you look at the ribs, as I told you, there are 12 pairs of ribs. Sometimes there can be cervical ribs, which can cause surgical problems. Sometimes there can be extra ribs, lumbar ribs. Sometimes the 12 pair of ribs may be completely missing. So as I told you, the bottom is not very fixed, variable. Facets will vary, ribs will vary, lengths will vary. There may be extra ribs, no ribs, and so on. Now, this 12 pair of ribs forms the largest part of the thoracic cage, and that is very important. And if you look at each of these ribs, I hope you all have got a rib somewhere soon. You'll get one at least, if you haven't got it now. They are very long, they are thin, they are curved, and they are twisted also. You should never be like ribs, you know. You must never be like ribs. Because you are curved and twisted then. You must never be curved and twisted. Nice to be long, thin and long, but not curved and twisted. So this is a very peculiar structure. If you know, I don't know how this evolved. It really beats me. Look at this structure. It's thin, it's long, it's curved, and it's twisted. More to come. That's the thoracic cage. There you are. You can see all the ribs are arranged there. Oh, sorry. Right. So if you look at this vertebral column, there you are. You find these ribs, which are at the top. The first 7 ribs, they are called true ribs. Why? Because they start at the vertebrae and they finish at the sternum. Of course, through costal cartilages, you can read. The first 1 to 7 roughly make direct contact with the sternum. So they are called true ribs, vertebro-sternal ribs. The balance are called 8 to 12 false ribs because they are vertebrocostal, not vertebrosternal. Then they are intercostal or interchondral. They attach themselves next to the above one, above one, above one, above one, and then attach themselves. So indirect attachment to the sternum. So in view of that, you call the first ones true ribs, the others false ribs. So that is something which is the dividing or the classifying aspect of the ribs. Up to 7 is true ribs, 8 to 12, rest is false ribs. Out of those false ribs, 11 and 12 do not have an attachment anteriorly. That's 11 with a little chondral or cartilage cap, that also has a cartilage cap, does not reach the sternum. So therefore, they call them floating ribs. Floating ribs. So you must get this terminology ready. True ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. So if you look at a typical rib, there you are, thin, long, curved, twisted. We have the head there with the 2 facets for the vertebra of its own level and the one above. We have a neck, which is a narrow region like our necks. So it's like a head and a neck. And then, of course, the next part is the body. But in that body, we have a little area which is called the tubercle area. There's an articular part and a non-articular part of the tubercle, which is a sort of a bony projection. and sometimes there's a facet also there. So the articular and non-articular part. Then the rib suddenly takes a turn. It suddenly turns forwards or anterior. And there's an angle there, and that's called the angle of the rib. If you take a typical rib, you'll see this angle very clearly. It comes and then suddenly it takes a turn. And that is an angle. In fact, when you sleep on your angles almost, because the ribs go into the vertebral columns. It's that part that is in touch with your mat or your mattress. Oh, sorry, my dear. Then, of course, we have the shaft, the main part, the body, the shaft which goes posteriorly, which goes a little bit posteriorly, then laterally, then curves round the body, comes forward like that, and that is the shaft. And then in that shaft, on the inferior surface, is a little groove or a little depression, which is called the costal groove, which you all would have seen. So, in a typical rib, those are the parts from there coming down like that, curving anteriorly, attached to the costal cartilage there, which attaches itself to the side of the body of the sternum or the manubrium, whatever. This is a typical rib. Then, of course, the atypical ribs, I have no time to go into that. The first rib is very peculiar, flat and so on, very shortest. Go and read about the first rib and the structures which are related to it. It is very, very important. The first rib is a very important structure. The structures which are related to it are very important from a surgical point of view. 1, 2, 11, and 12 are the atypical ribs. Why is this happening today? I told you the first one. I'm not going beyond that. It's broadest, it's most curved, it's the shortest. It forms the inlet, as I told you. There are a lot of important structures. One facet for the body, and tubercle, there is a tubercle, and so on. So that is a typical first rib, and it falls into the category of atypical ribs. And there are the second rib, and so on, which is less curved, and so on. Go, not much of importance there, but go and read a little bit about it. And of course, we have 11 and 12, which are floating ribs, which are again little pieces of bone with a little cap there, not very important. Now, this is the first rib, this is the first costal cartilage. So these are the costal cartilages which bridge this rib to the sternum. What are these costal cartilages? They are flattened bars of hyaline cartilage. They are found at the anterior ends of the ribs. They are really parts of unossified embryonic cartilage ribs. So in ossification, this is all cartilage. It all got ossified except a small region in front. And that remain as your costal cartilages. And therefore, these remain as costal cartilages and a whole lot below that. And therefore, these give a lot of flexibility, elasticity, mobility to the ribs. So these ribs, these costal cartilages are very important because the ribs depend on these for their movement. As you can see, the length of the costal cartilages increase from 1 to 7. It increases. The length increases. So, these are the costal cartilages, unossified bone, as it's unossified bone. And you find a set here, and a few find the set here, and those are the ones which bridge. So this is a costochondral joint, really. So though we call this a costosternal joint, this is really a chondrosternal joint. So this is a costochondral joint. This is a chondrosternal joint, where the cartilages fit into that. Now, if you look at 1 to 7, they are connected with the sternum. 8, 9, and 10 are connected to each other, you can see. 11 and 12 just have pointed tips, as I told you. So these are the true ribs with those costal cartilages. And these are the ones, one attaches to the one above. And this is a border, a costal cartilage border, cartilaginous, which all of us have. Right hypochondrium in the abdomen, is a left hypochondrium. You palpate for the liver here, you palpate for the spleen here. So if you even now put your hand there, you will see that it's flexible, it goes inside. It's not hard. Why? Because these are interconnecting costal cartilages. Interconnecting costal cartilage. So that is your costal margin. 7 to 10, the 7 to 10 costal cartilages form your costal margin, where you palpate these important structures. So we did earlier some joints, costovertebral, costotransverse. They were all synovial joints. Now let's look at the joints in front. How about this one? The first chondrosternal joint. There's no joint. The cartilage goes directly into the manubrium. It's called a synchondrosis, or a primary cartilaginous joint. There's no joint. So no joint means no movement between the first and this. 2nd to 7. 2nd to 7 are synovial joints. Then we have on the yellow marking 8 to 10. 8, 9, 10. 11 and 12 are posterior. These are connected to each other, but the joints which are connecting one chondra, as it were, one chondro to another chondro, the interchondral joints, are also synovial joints. So in summary, all the joints in front which are associated with the sternum are synovial joints, except the first, which is a synchondrosis, or a primary cartilaginous joint, which means that these are the joints which are going to move in rib movement. So except for this, all these are synovial joints. And these between the costal cartilages are also synovial joints. Very easy to remember. So basically all are synovial joints except that. This one. How about the costochondral joint? This bone becomes cartilage, where this is covered by periosteum. This is also covered by periosteum, but because it did not ossify, you call it perichondrium. So periosteum continues to perichondrium. Bone continues as cartilage, continuous, nothing. So there is no movement at these costochondral joints. Remember, there are no movement. This is one structure moving together. So the rib is one structure right there up to that point, with of course the cartilaginous component. That's all. But no movement here, obviously. Then it will never move the sternum. Then. If there's movement there, the sternum won't move. Sternum can't move because there'll be movement here when the rib moves. Who wants this? We want the sternum to move. So this is not a joint. It's just passing through. Anteriorly, therefore, we have done now the sides. We are coming to the anterior end. Is the sternum, made up of the manubrium and the body, and a joint they are called the manubriosternal joint, which is quite flexible in young people. It projects a little anteriorly, very good landmark for your second attachment, second costal cartilage attachment, which is a very important landmark. And it is a secondary cartilaginous, or what is called a symphysis of sort. There's a little bit of movement. It gets closed up in older people. And this is like a symphysis, but otherwise there's a little bit of movement here. The manubriosternal joint, not a synovial joint. It is a secondary cartilaginous joint, something like a symphysis, but with a little bit of movement. The manubrium. So manubrium, body, and this little thing, the xiphoid process. So the body articulates with this process, which is the xiphoid process. And this joint here, this is the manubriosternal joint. This joint is called xiphisternal joint. The xiphisternal joint, which is also symphysis. Usually closes up very early, by about 40s it closes up. No point having that. So this is the sternum, made up of its three important components with two joints there, which are symphysis. Right, so we went right from the back, right to the front. Now we go to the top, the thoracic inlet, the lungs on either side, the apices of the lungs, the pleura covering it, the pleural space, cervical pleura covering that. That's the one that is there. Yes. And on top of that, there's a suprapleural membrane, I told you, which closes it up nicely. Otherwise, each time you breathe, you find your lungs coming out and inflating your neck. Not a very pleasant sight. So the suprapleural membranes are strong membranes which attach itself to the first rib, the inner surface of the first rib, and the investing fascia, and closes this off. So it attaches to the inner border of the first rib there and to the investing fascia here and closes it up like a tent, so that the top is closed completely and the lung is nicely protected. Dropping down there, can you see the sloping inlet? Posterior end is much at a higher level than the anterior. We drop to the bottom, and there you are, is the outlet, closed off by this musculotendinous structure, which takes off from this lumbar vertebrae and fans out and nicely closes it, keeping a musculotendinous middle area for structures to pass up and down. So the outlet is bordered by the 12th thoracic vertebra. On the sides, the costal margin, as you can see, the lower costal margin, and the xiphisternal joint here. So 12th thoracic vertebra, the costal margin coming right round, and the xiphisternal joint. That's the outlet which is closed off by the diaphragm. So this is the diaphragm, therefore, attached to all the lower six ribs. There you are. This is the crus of the diaphragm. There's some structures coming through like the esophagus here. And this is the tendinous part of the musculotendinous diaphragm. Veins taking the blood up, arteries bringing the blood down, esophagus taking it right through, and so on. So structures go from the thorax to the abdomen through the musculotendinous septum. And this is the dome-shaped diaphragm. Dome-shaped. Periphery is like a dome. Dome is like an arch like this. You find it in churches. Domes. Right dome, left dome, right dome a little bit higher. And in the center, there is the tendon of the diaphragm. They are all attached here by this crura, right crus and left crus, which supplies the muscles to the rest of the diaphragm. The diaphragm, which closes the outlet, is the principal muscle of respiration. It is the principal muscle of respiration. What is the shape? When you look at it from in front, it has two domes, the right dome, the left dome. The right dome comes to almost the upper border of the fifth rib. So if you look at your fifth rib, you'll see how high this dome comes. And roughly the left border, which is a little bit below, is at the left border of the fifth. That is very rough, very rough. Just to impress on you the importance that the diaphragm is not near your umbilicus. It is up in the thorax. Comes high up. The right one is more prominent, deeper, where the liver, right lobe of the liver is there. And that is the diaphragm. On the side, I have shown you this picture before, it's J-shaped, inverted J. Anteriorly, it has a superior attachment. Posteriorly, it has a more inferior attachment. So that's your diaphragm. So, knowing the bones now, at the back, on the sides, in front, the joints involved, the inlet closed completely, the outlet closed, but mobile. Let's get on to movements of the thoracic cage. If you look at the movements of the thoracic cage, if you look at the thorax proper, the real thorax, now this is a part which it's sometimes difficult to understand. That's why I always like to give this lecture as much as possible to get it across to you. It's a challenge. There are lots of muscles which are involved in the movements of the thoracic cage. These are the groups. The intercostals, the subcostals. Why I put this in yellow is a group of muscles called the transversus thoracis. Then there is the first cousins of the serratus anterior. Don't write that down. The serratus posterior at the back. Not one muscle, but two muscles. One is superiorly placed, other is inferiorly placed. So serratus posterior superior and serratus posterior inferior. And some small muscles, a group of them, called levatores costorum. Levatores costorum. Very nice Latin word. Simple. Costa means rib. Levator means race. So these are the rib races, ones which rise. So these elevate the ribs, the levatores costorum. Serratus, because it's got an irregular line, that's why you call it serratus. Right, let's get down to business. This transversus thoracic group, I will mention it whenever I come across, but it is made up of three components. A muscle called the sternocostalis, which is related to the posterior aspect of the sternum, and goes and attaches itself from the sternum to the ribs. So you call it sternocostalis. Little muscles, small fellows, which jump from one rib to another, they are called the subcostalis. They are called the subcostal muscles. And of the three intercostal muscles, the innermost one, not the external, not the internal, the innermost, the third one, that is called the innermost intercostals. So these three are the muscles. When I come across, I will say transversus thoracis. Now, if you look at the rib is the one that we have to move. Because if you move the rib, we move the thoracic cage. If you move the thoracic cage, we drag the parietal pleura with its connective tissue outside. If we drag the parietal pleura, we create a negative pressure in the pleural space. And if we create a negative pressure in the pleural space, the atmospheric pressure will obviously, from outside, be sucked into the lungs with its visceral pleura and inflate it. So as you go that way, air comes the other way. So we have to move the ribs, in other words. outwards, this way, that way, increase the cage. Whatever it is, increase. Who increases the cage? The ribs increase the cage. So therefore, we have got muscles which extend from rib to rib, vertebra to rib, sternum to rib. Final destination is rib. Is rib. In addition, we have got other muscles like the pectoralis muscles, serratus anterior. When I say pectoralis muscles, the major and the minor. We have the serratus anterior. And then we have other muscles like the scalene muscles. We have got the sternocleidomastoid muscles. And if you go a little bit further, you'll have latissimus dorsi also playing a role. Remember latissimus dorsi, the fine fellow who starts off in the back of the pelvis and the lumbar fascia and so on, wide origin. And then we have the other muscles which help in respiration. So there are a whole lot of muscles, the other muscles being the abdominal muscles. External oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis, the rectus abdominis which is going. All of them will help. All of them will help in the movement of these ribs and are associated with respiration. Let's see how. Intercostals. Let's look at the intercostals first. Here is a section. Here is a rib, thoracic cage. Here is a section cut out with the two ribs, costal groove, upper rib, lower rib, extending from the outer aspect of the upper rib to the upper aspect, external aspect of the lower rib. We find this first outer group of muscles, the external intercostals. Fibers are going as if you're putting your hand into your pocket. Then we have exactly in the opposite direction, a little bit more inside, another group of muscles which start anteriorly and go back posteriorly. In the exactly opposite direction, the internal intercostal muscles. That is like putting your hand into the inner pocket of your coat. You go the opposite direction. Then we have the costal groove there with the vein, artery and nerve. Here that's the opposite, coming off the neurovascular space. And just inside that is the third muscle, which is the innermost intercostal muscle, which is there, whose direction of fibers is also almost in the direction of the internal intercostal. External, internal, innermost. Neurovascular bundle between the second and third layer. And these are the intercostal muscles. External, when it pulls like that, it's like pulling your trousers. You put your hand in your trousers and you pull it up. What happens to your trouser? It goes up. So similarly, the ribs go up. That's the internal intercostal. It goes in the opposite direction like that. So when that pulls, what happens to the ribs is the ribs depress. The innermost intercostal also does the same thing. Like the internal intercostal, when it pulls, the rib is pulled down. Now, we have come across the first lot of the transversus thoracis, the innermost intercostal. So when this happens, what happens to the rib cage? The ribs will rise because one rib is pulling on the other rib. The ribs will rise. There are enough synovial joints. There are synovial joints all over here. Here, synovial joints at the back, costovertebral and costotransverse, whole lot. All these are synovial joints. All these are synovial joints. So the ribs will move up, increasing the thoracic cage. That shows you intercostal space a little bit more vividly, a little more clearly, how the branches come in, how the lateral branches come, how the anterior branches come, the internal thoracic vessel there in relationship to the sternum there. That's the costal cartilage, and that's your rib. The costovertebral joint, costotransverse joint is right there. So there's movement all over, and the ribs rise up. Subcostals, I told you, small little fellows who jump. They are in the region of the angle of the rib. Can you see? This is the angle of the rib. I told you it suddenly takes a turn. So these are the angle of the rib you find. This is an anterior view. The angle of the rib, you find these little fellows. At the angle of the rib on the internal surface jumps 2 or 3 ribs below. Jumps 2 or 3 ribs below. And they are like that. And they are on the internal surface. They are not on the external surface. On the internal surface of the rib. This is the inside of the thoracic vein. They cross 1 or 2 spaces. And they are in the direction of the internal intercostals. So they are supposed to depress the ribs. Not very sure. Not very sure. Challenging. But they're supposed to depress the ribs. So these are the subcostals. Sub means below. Very easy to remember. So this is the second lot of the transversus thoracis. The second lot. First was the innermost intercostal. Now the subcostal. One more to go. The third lot of the transversus thoracic is the sternocostalis. Now the sternocostalis is once again a muscle which, as the name implies, extends from the sternum to the ribs. From the sternum to the ribs. Look at this. Here's the sternum. Now we are inside, mind you. We are inside the thoracic cage. Let us say we are with our backs to the thoracic vertebral bodies. We are looking at the back of the sternum. At the bottom here, you find all these muscles. 4 to 5 slits on each side, radiating from the lower end of the sternum, and they go and attach themselves to the back, to the posterior surface of the costal cartilages. Like the palm of your hand. You keep the palm of your hand behind the sternum. Take a thoracic cage, put your hand through the outlet and keep your hand there. That's what it looks like. Sternocostalis muscle. The third group of the transversus thoracic. So now, I don't have to give you the answer. If these muscles pull, what will it do to the costal cartilages? It will pull it down. So this is a depressor, not an elevator. So all this time we have been coming across all depressors except the external intercostal, which is an elevator. Most of these are depressing it. So this is the sternocostalis. So we have finished the transversus thoracic 3 muscles. We have finished the external intercostals. We have finished the internal intercostals. Now we get on to the relations of the serratus anterior. That is divided into 2 serratus posterior, the superior one and the inferior one. If you look at the superior one, you don't have to know the origins and insertions, but the positions. Right? The easiest way to remember is that it takes off from the spines at the junction of the cervical and thoracic vertebrae. C7, T1, 2, 3 at the junction from the spines, and it goes laterally. It goes laterally and downwards to the superior borders of the second, third, fourth ribs. So it goes laterally down the side. So if there's a person seated in front of me, showing the back to me, the back of the thorax, they'll be going like that. So that when they pull, what happens? When it pulls this way, it pulls from here, it pulls that way, it elevates the ribs. So serratus posterior superior elevates the ribs. Very easy to remember. Superior elevates up. So this is the upper one. Serratus posterior inferior is just a mirror image of this. A little bit bigger, but mirror image of this. Put a mirror here, this is what it is. It takes off from the thoracolumbar joint, T11 and L1 and 2. And then what does that do? It can't go downwards, it goes upwards. It goes upwards and laterally, attaching itself to the lower 3 or 4 ribs. You can see that. And when that pulls, what does it do to the ribs? It pulls the ribs down. So serratus posterior inferior pulls the ribs inferiorly. Serratus posterior superior pulls up the ribs superiorly. Very easy. Simple. They are mirror images. The other balance of this is your serratus anterior, which is on the lateral and anterior aspect of your thoracic cage. That's your serratus anterior. Very complicated muscle. So now we have an elevator and a depressor here. Then those little fellows. I love this name, Levatorus costorum. I love it. 12 little fan-shaped, fan-like even, just, radiating like that. From the transverse processes, they go out and attaches to the tubercles of the ribs. Little pieces. Short, small. You don't see these in dissections unless you dissect it very carefully. So these are coming from superior to inferior. So when they pull from their origins, from their transverse process points to the tubercle where it is attached, they are going down. The ribs elevate. Then you might ask me, what is the small fellows? When all the small fellows get together, the 12 on one side, 12 on the other side, 24 fellows pulling, it's like a tug of war. It does have a significant pull. So they elevate the ribs. The Levatorus costorum elevates the ribs. So these are elevators, small fellows, the levators. Right. That is the spectrum of muscles, the whole lot of muscles. Let's look at the mechanics and bring in the other accessory muscles. You all know the mechanics of respiration. 16 to 20 per minute in kids and old people. Others, I don't know. You inspire air, take it in through the nose, mouth, larynx, trachea, and ultimately, of course, final destination, lungs. Perform the function and push it out, expiration. So inspiration, expiration. Take it in, take it out. You can expire it in any way you like. Nose and mouth, whatever. Or nose only, or mouth only, it doesn't matter. So that is inspiration, expiration. So what happens? Cage and the parietal pleural diameters, if they can be increased, both the transverse, the anteroposterior, and the vertical diameter, they can be increased. The pleural cavity pressure will drop, and the air at atmospheric pressure will swoosh in. You'll just fly in. So you create the thoracic cage, the negative pressure, so that the air can come in. Now, just look at a little more closely at this. This is the pleural cavity. This is the thoracic cavity. This is the pleural cavity. Lung here, lung there. You take a little piece and enlarge it. A little piece from here. This is what you see. You see the visceral pleura there. Then you see the parietal pleura. And just inside the parietal pleura is the pleural cavity. There you are. You can see that. So we have the lung, visceral pleura, pleural cavity, parietal pleura, thoracic cage, connective tissue here. Pull this out, parietal pleura will pull out, negative pressure will be created, lung tissue will be nicely aerated. So this is the structure. So let us look at quiet respiration. Let us look at quiet respiration. Now what all of you all are doing is you are at quiet respiration. You don't even feel it. So what is the main structure which is helping you in your quiet respiration? a structure which increases the vertical diameter. You keep your hand on your abdomen in quiet respiration, you can feel it coming forward and going backwards. So in quiet respiration, we have one diameter being increased very easily through the intervention of this diaphragm and the axis that is inflated, the diameter that is inflated is the vertical diameter. That is the vertical diameter. So that vertical diameter is going to be increased with the help of this diaphragm, which is like a dome, which when it contracts from here, will flatten out, increasing this. So we have to have the roof fixed. The roof is fixed by your suprapleural, cervical pleura, suprapleural membrane, and it's fixed. There is no movement there. The diaphragm contracts. When it contracts, the dome flattens by as much as 5 to 10 centimeters. And as the dome flattens, this dome, as it flattens, comes down. And it presses on the abdominal contents and the intra-abdominal muscle pressure then increases. So you can hold it if you like, or you can relax the anterior abdominal wall and take that pressure. That's why if you keep your hand there, you will see it going up and down. Each time you inspire, the anterior abdominal wall goes forward, and when you expire, it goes backwards, allowing that in turn, the diaphragm pushing down effect to be controlled. So the abdominal wall will relax, dome will flatten, vertical diameter will increase, and we have one diameter increase with the help of this wonderful structure, which is the diaphragm, which pulls from here, and flattens this. So it's like a piston. That's what's called a piston movement. That's the diaphragm there. That's the thoracic cavity. That's the abdomen. That's the intra-abdominal pressure. So this is the intra-abdominal pressure. That's the diaphragm. That's the diaphragm. This is the piston, which is the air coming in from here. So like the diaphragm moves like a piston to push the diaphragm, flatten it, and push it against the intra-abdominal pressure. That's what happens. So the abdominal wall relaxes, takes the pressure. And when you're expiring, it's just the reverse. Diaphragm flattens and then now becomes a dome back again, back to the old state, pushes the air out, and the anterior abdominal wall pushes the viscera and the intra-abdominal pressure, conducts it, pushes this way, and the air is out. So this way is inspiration, that way is. So what we see in the diaphragm is a piston movement. What are the other diameters which we have to increase now? Vertical is not enough. Is not enough. We need the transverse diameter, the horizontal, side to side. Now here, the first 10 ribs play a very important role. Really speaking, from 2 to 10, that's where your angle of Louis attachment of the second costal cartilage, from that point right down to the 10 ribs, not the last 12, 10. Now, if you look at those ribs in that region, you will see that the ribs are curved. They are curved forwards, and their lateral curve is below a point joining the anterior end to the posterior end. I don't know whether you can visualize it. It's like that. How can I show it? Oh, I wish I was on a stage. Let us say this is one rib. This is the vertebral attachment. This is the sternal attachment. And then the rib has a curve. That is your cubital fossa, the forehand and upper arm. So it is like this, where the line joining the anterior end to the posterior end, that is the line joining my hand to my shoulder, the line joining that is at a level which is much higher than the curve of the rib. So look at this. Here and here are almost the same. But this handle of this bucket, the curve is below this line joining these two. Can you see that? So that you have the two hands like this. The elbows are at a lower level than the wrist joint and the shoulder joint. Put it like that. If I take a rib, visualize it. So that it is like a bucket handle. So what we need to do is raise the rib. Raise this lateral curve, which is at a point below the line joining the anterior end to the posterior end. This curve is below, like that. So if we can raise the ribs, what happens when the rib comes up? When this handle comes up, can you see? It's horizontal. Can you see this little bit? The rib has gained extra little bit. The bucket that was having this diameter, now having only on one side, mind you, this amount. So that it will have a diameter stretching from here to about here. Because simply the rib came up. The lateral curve, which is below the line joining the anterior and posterior ends, now straightens up. And therefore, you increase the horizontal or the transverse diameter of this rib cage. This is like the movement of a bucket handle, and therefore you call it the bucket handle movement. I hope it's clear. If you remember, the hand and shoulder are at one level, and the elbow is at another level, and the elbow is the curve of the rib. Then you will know if you want to bring your elbow up, right down, so that the wrist, the shoulder, and the elbow, all three are at the same level, then you will realize that it has to go a little bit out. We have to go a little bit out to do that. That little bit extra is your transverse diameter on both sides. So the 2nd to the 10th rib play an important role in increasing the transverse diameter. Now, when all this is happening, the first rib is fixed by the scalenus anterior and the scalenus medius. And when this happens, the first rib is fixed by the scalene muscles, anterior and medius, and the costovertebral joint is there at the back. The chondrosternal joint is here at the front, which I have done. Both of them are synovial joints. And we have this movement which is going that way, outwards. And that movement, therefore, takes place to an axis passing through the costovertebral joint posteriorly and the chondrosternal joint anterior. So this is the axis, and then the rib goes up. This rib goes up. Because this was at a lower level from a line between this point to that point. So what happens? The intercostals raise the ribs, and therefore we have the transverse diameter increased. How about the anteroposterior diameter? The last diameter. We did the transverse diameter or the horizontal axis. We did the vertical through the piston movement of the diaphragm. Earlier one, of course, was the bucket handle. Handles coming up. Now we have anteroposterior diameter. The sternum must be moved forward. The entire sternum doesn't move like that. There's a manubriosternal joint here, which moves forward quite a lot, which goes forward. On this, like a hinge joint, there's this little symphysis here, which moves. And here, once again, the first rib is fixed by the scalene, and we have ribs 2 to 6. 2 to 6. Even, in fact, a little bit, yeah, it's 2 to 6, yes. It's 2 to 6. The anterior ends moving upwards. Now I'm going to add something more to this crooked twisted rib. Earlier I said its curve, lateral curve was below a point joining the posterior end, shoulder joint, to the anterior end, wrist joint. Now I'm telling you the rib is curved not only like that with the lateral curve below that line, but it has the anterior end at a level below the posterior end. In other words, the shoulder joint is at a higher point than the wrist joint. Do you understand that? So that if we can raise the ribs up like that, so that the wrist joint and the shoulder joint come to the same level, well, to do that, the rib will have to go a little bit forward. As you can see here, this was the original position of the rib. This is the new position of the rib. And there is this little distance that has gone extra, a little bit of extra length or extra anteroposterior diameter by virtue of the anterior ends of the rib being at a lower level than the posterior end. When you raise it, it can easily be raised, and when it is raised, the manubrium and the sternum also move forward, thereby again achieving or acquiring a little more space, a little more distance, a few centimeters. Now this is just like those pump handles, which we call artisan wells or tube wells. It moves like that. So because it resembles that, they used to call it the pump handle movement. So the sternal end is raised, it moves forwards, and there's manubriosternal movement here. And therefore, we have the pump handle movement, which increases the anteroposterior joint. We have the bucket handle movement, which increases the horizontal or transverse diameter. And we have the piston movement, which increases the vertical diameter. So all work together, wow, it just goes out. Rib cage expands. There you are. That shows the sternum. This point is at a lower point than this. This curve is at a lower point than a line joining these two. That is the basis of the pump handle and the bucket handle movement. That's the costovertebral joint. That's the costotransverse joint. So in an anteroposterior movement increase, the axis passes through a joint, which is where both joints are posterior. And this, when there's movement here, rolling and gliding here, this goes up. So it is like you just twist it up. So when it came to bucket handle, it was costovertebral and chondrosternal. Pump handle, costovertebral and costotransverse. Both joints, the axis posteriorly. And the movement there amplifies and takes the manubriosternal joint forwards, tilts it, turns the sternum forwards, and with that, an increase of the anteroposterior diameter. By now, it should be clear to you. Intercostal muscles again to the rescue. Raise the ribs. So the costovertebral joint, costotransverse joint, the famous joints, the axis passes through that, and the anterior ends of the rib goes up. Pump handle movement. So there are the three joints. Vertical diameter is increased by the flattening of the diaphragm. Transverse diameter is increased by the bucket handle movement. Anteroposterior diameter is increased at the manubriosternal joint, 2 to 6 main ribs, pushing it forward with the pump handle movement. So that diameter is increased, this diameter is increased, the vertical diameter and the horizontal anteroposterior diameter is increased, and we have the rib cage increasing in volume, pulling the parietal pleura. So in quiet inspiration, that's what you had. The diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, the external intercostal, pulling it up, releasing it, pulling it up, releasing it. In quiet expiration, which you all are doing now, mine is a little bit more. because I'm speaking. Once it has become fully extended, inspired, fully inspired, stretched, the elastic recoil of the lungs gives way, relaxes, and the elasticity goes down. The relaxed intercostal muscles and the relaxing diaphragm, they start relaxing. The anterior abdominal wall muscles will start contracting and increasing their tone, pushing the abdomen in so that it will help the diaphragm to rise to its dome level. So diaphragm is relaxing now, intercostal muscles are relaxing, lungs elasticity has relaxed, getting back to its base, anterior abdominal wall muscles contracting, pushing it inwards. And the serratus posterior inferior also, in its own way, pull down the muscles, pull down like that, and therefore with it the ribs, and bring the lower ribs down and helping in quiet expiration. So that is quiet inspiration and quiet expiration. Now there are instances when you have forced inspiration. When you're singing, when you're performing ballet, in certain sports, if you're an asthmatic and you're struggling to breathe, you need increased capacity. Here the rib cage itself has to be pulled up. Rib cage, it has to be pulled up, stretched as much as possible. The scalenes come in here. Sternomastoid, sternocleidomastoid, because it has two heads, one from the sternum, one from the clavicle. The sternocleidomastoid also pulls it up like that. So it pulls the cage up. In fact, the erector spinae at the back, which I haven't got here, also pull up and straighten up the cervical spine. Because you want to go into another anatomical position. So the rib cage is pulled up. And now we have the origin and insertion of the pectoralis major, mainly the sternocostal origin. Sternocostal origin. In fact, it is the sternocostal origin. Sternocostal origin attached to the lateral lip of the bicipital groove. The asthmatic will keep the hands still on the chair, or will hold on to a chair like this. Stabilize the insertion of the deltoid, of the pectoralis major. And from that point, this will become the origin, and it will pull on the sternocostal origin, raising the ribs, giving it a little more force. So the ribs are brought upwards and outwards through the pectoralis major. This is a situation where the origin and insertion change. You fix the insertion by holding on to a table or resting your hand on a chair. That's how asthmatics breathe. They won't breathe like this. They breathe like that to get the full pectoralis out. At the same time, the scapula is fixed. What are the muscles which fix the scapula? Scapula is a bone which moves all over the place. No. It has to be fixed. The levator scapulae goes into contraction. The trapezial fibers go into contraction. The rhomboids, major and minor, contract. Hold the scapula fixed. Why? Because something is going to move from the scapula onto the ribs. What is that? There is a muscle. There are in fact two muscles which connect the scapula to the ribs. One is the serratus anterior. Look at that. Serratus anterior. Attached to the upper 8 ribs, 8 digitations. Most of it, at least about 5 attached to the inferior angle, helping in the lateral rotation and the second 90 degrees. You all know that. The upper fibers, of course, when they contract, they will depress the ribs. But the lower fibers, they will elevate the ribs. They'll pull from the medial border, medial vertebral border of the scapula. It will pull. The scapula is now stabilized and it will take the ribs out. So this is another accessory muscle of respiration. In forced inspiration, Don't forget this minor fellow, pectoralis minor. Coming from 3, 4, and 5, attached to the coracoid process, which is a part of the scapula. The coracoid process is fixed because the scapula is fixed. And it will start pulling up in its own little way on those ribs and bring the ribs up. So this is again where you have a change of origin and insertion. And we have these two muscles assisting forced inspiration. And then, of course, the serratus posterior superior, which when it pulls, it will pull that way, which means these ribs will go up. So with the serratus anterior, serratus posterior superior, pectoralis minor, the pectoralis major, and with the stability of the scalene muscles and the sternomastoids, which in their own way not only stabilize the thoracic cage, but pull it up a little bit, pull it up. They're all trying to increase it forcibly because this poor man needs air. The thoracic cage is virtually torn apart. So these are the accessory muscles which help when there is forced inspiration needed. Now something extra which happens in forced inspiration is the diaphragm also. The diaphragm pulls down and depresses this and pulls down. This depresses, disregard the arrows. It depresses it and it flattens it. But once it comes to a maximal point where the liver is there, it hits the liver, it can't depress anymore. They have found that at that point, these crural fibers, muscle fibers, they pull on this diaphragm and they pull so much at the end of flattening that these lower fibers, which are attached to the lower 6 ribs, get pulled up like that on right round, with the result that these ribs will get elevated. So in other words, the diaphragm is not over. It comes into the last minute rescue. At the terminal end, once it can't go anymore, it will make that little pull so that it will elevate the ribs like that. Because it can't flatten anymore. The liver has come down from like that flat liver, nothing more. Now it just pulls so that there is an elevation of the ribs because of the attachment of the peripheral muscles of the diaphragm to the ribs. So this is a parting gift from the diaphragm to that person who is struggling for breath, dyspneic. So the lower ribs are raised. So see how the anatomy is so finely tuned to get this amount of help and support and exploit the diaphragm so much. You have taken a forced breath, forced inspire, everything, all the accessory muscles, everything. Now it's forced expiration, like blowing a trumpet or any other, those wind instruments. Forced, so for that, you need the forcible contraction of the anterior abdominal wall musculature. External oblique, internal oblique, transverse abdominis, and that 2 bands, the rectus abdominis. They all pull, and they squeeze the anterior abdominal wall and force the diaphragm up so that you can forcibly expire. That is forced expiration. Then, of course, in forced expiration, your good old latissimus dorsi also compresses the lower part of the thorax and helps to get rid of this air, extra air which has been pumped in. Okay. So if you look at depression of ribs, in summary, like we have the serratus posterior inferior. We have the internal intercostals. And we have the sternocostalis. These all help to depress the ribs, just to recollect what I have done. So with that, the expiration is over. So remember, elevators I did, these are the main depressors which come into the picture. And here is this wonderful thoracic cage which performed all these functions with those important synovial joints which are here, here, all over here, except this, and this is also not a joint. This is a symphysis where you have a movement, like a hinge joint movement for the pump handle movement. Okay, that finishes the movement.